want to show you how to build this white oak desk end to end, showing you all the skills so you can follow along and build it too. Okay, so when we start a project, first off, you want to design it. Before you begin any project, you want to design it full. I'm one of those individuals that likes to just jump into anything and then kind of figure it out as you go. But I find out when you actually sit down, dedicate some time, and put your thoughts down on paper, it will make the process going to the lumber mill much easier, less stressful. And what you've seen here is I went around and marked all these. I actually did a lot of this at the lumber mill, but I want to demonstrate it here to give you an idea of what that looks like if you're to go out and buy your own hardwood. So here is an example of, let's see if you can see that, my design. You can see one of the first things I start with is the kind of overall idea. So I want to have like a minimalist, executive, in between executive and writing style type desk. And I want to focus on minimalist, so kind of like Scandinavian type style. So a lot of natural wood grains, using white oak here. And I mark out my dimensions. And then after I mark out my rough kind of like dimensions of how big the table is, or the desk, then I move into what that actual design looks like. I'll do a front profile, a side profile, and a kind of a 45-degree profile. And this gives me kind of a lens on all the different angles and styles that I put into designing this. Okay, once you make this, going to the lumber mill is less stressful, much easier, and you'll probably get really good at budgeting for your projects. If you go in there blind, you'll always spend way more than what you thought, or you probably underbought and you'll have to go back to the lumber mill. This will help eliminate a lot of stress and headaches. Don't skip this process.
What type of materials should I look for at the lumber mill? First, I like to take a look at my notepad and put notes next to each part of the desk. So like tops, legs, apron, so on. For example, for my tabletop, I don't want to see any knots or sapwood in this section. The tabletop is a focus point for the desk, so I try to emphasize which boards get selected for that section that would fit that category. There are, however, certain types of boards you need to account for. If the board has knots, this is okay, but be sure to mark which pieces can fit between the knots. That way you're not wasting a ton of material. There are boards that need to be avoided as much as possible. These are the boards that are bowed or twisted significantly. During the milling process, you will find that most often the board will become useless after you milled it down to a flat, referenceable state. Each time you tackle a project, be sure to mark these at the lumber mill and then assess them as you start the project. This endeavor will help develop your skill and eye for picking good lumber. Now on to the milling process. So first part of this, you're going to cut your boards to a rough length. And you want to cut them as short as possible, but not the final length. You don't want to send a 12-foot board through a joiner or a planer, trust me. This step will improve the quality of your milling and the speed. And by the way, I used to hate breaking down material because I didn't have a good miter saw set up. And what used to take me over an hour now only takes me about 10 minutes. I got the build video up in the top corner. If you're interested in getting one yourself, take a peek. Also, one thing to note, when you're cutting down the rough length, if your plater tends to create a lot of snipe, say 2 to 3 inches, be sure to account for that when you're cutting your boards. This is the first time I get all my rough cut material together, and I like to put them in each of their own category. So I have my tabletop in one, my legs in another, apron, stretcher, and so on. And this is the first time that I get a real good look at A, do I have the right amount of material, and B, do I have the right piece for that. And by doing this allows me to see if I'm going to be missing anything and should I go back into my scrap pile or waste bin or extra pieces of material and should I make an additional cut. Nothing is more frustrating than going back into the milling process when you find out one of your boards doesn't meet the requirements of what you want to do for that particular piece. So this little tip is great. Take the time. It's only about 5 minutes, but it helps.
So we have all of our pieces rough cut to length. The next part of the milling process is coming over to the joiner. And this allows us to create a reference face or edge that allows us to move to the other parts of our milling process. Now let's take a look at how I actually run this through because this helps prevent tear out and waste of material. So let's take a look. Here is the jointer. The way this creates a reference point is that there is a lower end feed table and a higher out feed table. And in between there, you got your set of blades that chips away at the piece of material. And the way that I push this through allows us to prevent tear out and waste of material. And the way that I go about that is, if you see the grain pattern here, I marked it here. So as the blade comes through, it scoops out material, and you want it to go the direction of the grain versus against. That way it prevents the tear out on the piece of material. The second piece is, I like to go cup side down. So this is a little exaggerated here, but the board actually has a slight bow. And this makes it easier where I can press down without it rocking as I push it through. So let's take a few passes like this. We'll see what kind of flat reference we get back.
While we're face joining this piece, I want to thank you for making it this far in the video. I'm a small YouTuber just starting out, and your watch time helps get my video out there. Also, if you're finding this style of breaking the process down step by step in detail, please let me know if you like that down in the comments. I got into woodworking about 3 years ago as a hobby, and I found I had to go to so many different videos to learn all these steps, and I thought it would be nice just to have it all in one video. And if you find it helpful, feel free to hit the like button and also subscribe if you want to keep watching these videos in the future. I greatly appreciate it.
Okay, now we have our flat reference, which now we can put against the fence to get a perfect 90 degree. And you'll make a few more passes on this to have S2S, so surface on two sides. This allows us to go over to the planer or over to the table saw to finish up this milling process. Okay, we now have all of our material S2S. That is where we have it surfaced on two sides. Now we're gonna get the third side, the parallel side to the bottom, done in the planer. What I will do now is get it to the kind of rough thickness. That will allow the piece of material to rest for a few days. Allows the moisture content to evaporate on both sides. And then I come back and do a final thickness just to ensure that it is parallel. What? quick flex here. Look how strong I am. Just kidding, I never use these. So yesterday we milled these down and I let them rest overnight. I stack and sticker them, see across the board here. Now when you mill longer boards, sometimes they tend to go back to their bowed state that you got them. You may have taken more material on one side. To help eliminate that, or at least reduce it, I like to stack and sticker them, but put the boards that are affected in a concave manner. So the higher part is right here, and I put the weight down in the center, so now I have 3 points of contact to flatten out the board. Now when I take this off, this will kind of keep its same position as it was. Previously it was about a 1/16 of an inch, so we'll see if it actually helped. Okay, so yeah, you can see it is still flat across the board here. So that process right there allows us to help eliminate some of the bow that happens during the milling process. Okay, so we have our tabletop out of the stack and sticker. We are now back at the table saw. And yesterday during our milling process, we created a edge joint on one of the sides. When we come back to the table saw, this completes our milling process to cut a parallel line using the table fence as a reference. You'll cut to the width that you need for your tabletop. For me, it kind of varies depending on how the board bows and whatnot. And let's get that going.
Now that we have the boards milled up, this is what the lumber is going to look like, or the tabletop is going to look like in kind of its near end state. And I like to put these in clamps as I do that process, because as you move material around your shop, you'll find that you'll have the boards somehow shift as you transfer from one place to the other. So I set them in here, get them in the way that I look, and it's all, you know, maker's perspective here on what you want to do. I generally look at, like, you know, different grain patterns, colors of the board, just to get an idea of what that visual, or the end game I want that visual to look like. And I'll get them all tidy up in here, and I'll keep them in here throughout the entire process until they're glued.
Okay, we got the boards milled up, ready for glue up. One of the things I wanted to demonstrate here is no matter how flat that you get your boards, somehow there is some undulating aspect of them. You may leverage a tool called a domino or biscuit joiner or dowels to get that more in line. I don't own any of those, but here's another way that you can get around it by creating cawls. So that way you have one underneath and one on top, and you can clamp to get equal pressure across. Now the additional step that I did here is I made these cambered on the insides. So when you put them together, there is a gap in between them. So when it presses above and below, it'll actually apply even pressure across the board. And you can see right here, this board is about a 1/16 of an inch proud to the other one. Now I can probably squeeze this together and get like a mallet, kind of mash it together. That's one method. But you can use this to ensure that it gets a seamless pressure across the board. Okay, so we finished it. Now you can see that that section right there that was proud, about a 1/16 of an inch, it is now completely gone. And this is just leftover lumber. This is actually scrap from an alternative piece that I was going to use for the tabletop. And ended up just making some calls out of it. So great way to flatten it without spending a ton of money on a tool that is definitely awesome, but this can do the same job. So we've done a dry run of this to get an idea of what I need to do to get it clamped and glued up properly. Another little tip that I like to do is when I unclamp it, I leave all the clamps in the respective areas to ensure that I'm not fumbling through the process. Since the glue has about an open time of about 10 minutes, you don't want to waste any time. So let's get to gluing. So the tabletop has been in its clamps for about 2 hours. This is at the time I like to come in and take a kind of a cheap chisel here. And I want it super sharp because I want to dig into the wood. But the glue that's squeezed out has firmed up enough that I can come and just pop it right up. Versus trying to clean it during the actual glue up process. It's just already a stressful situation, so I don't really worry about it then. And I can come back here and it cleans up very nice versus trying to do it all at once. Personal preference, but this works for me. Next part of this build is the legs. And I have 2 requirements on this. One is I want a slight angle to the leg, so I have a little bit of characteristic to the furniture piece. 2 is I want the leg to be inset, like the bottom of the leg, the inset from the top of the table about 1 inch in. Now in times past, I would just mock this up and try to, in a very crude way, reverse engineer with a tape measure and guess the angles to what this looks like. And I have not found on YouTube the exact math on how to actually get to the dimensions that we need. But I came across some physics courses on YouTube that explained, you know, it sounds sad, but the Pythagorean theorem, which is, I believe, algebra, and then using trigonometry, like the inverse tangent, to get the degree angle and the exact length of legs. So I want to spend 60 seconds to give you that little nugget of information, so the next time that you design furniture, you can do it yourself to the exact degree. All right, let's do it. Here is a mock-up of the table design that I want to go for. I know that I want the table to be 29 inches tall. The tabletop is about 1 inch thick. So from floor to the bottom of the tabletop, that's going to be 28 inches. The other design requirement that I have is that I want the legs to be slightly angled, about a 5-degree angle on both sides. So either 85 degrees or 95 degrees, depending on which side you look at. The third thing is that the table width is 25 inches wide, and I want at least a 1 inch inset on both sides, so 2 inches total, that I want the legs to be in from the edge. So when you're walking, that you're not going to trip over it. So I have 2 questions. One, what is the leg length that I need to create? And then what is the apron length, so I can ensure that I have both the inset on the sides and the correct length, so I can get the height that I want. And there are 2 math problems that we'll use here, which is first a trigonometry function of tangent. This will give you the degree angle In this case, we know the degree angle, but we have to reverse it to get the actual leg length. And then to get the leg length, you'll use an algebraic function or equation, which is Pythagorean theorem, which is a squared plus b squared equals c squared. That will give you the length. So let me walk you through that and calculate real quick. Here is our table with all the calculations broken out. We talked about the knowns. We know that we have an 85 degree here. We know that we have 28 inches from tabletop to floor. We will use our trigonometry function of inverse tangent, but we'll have to break it down because we don't know the depth of that triangle. So we know that we have 28 inches here. We know we have 85 degrees. To get that depth, we have to reverse this and do 85 divided by 28, which gets us 2.5 inches roughly. And if we want to break out and understand what is this distance between here, we have our width, which is 25 inches. We know we want an inch on both sides to inset, so that's -2. And we know that that triangle is roughly 2.5 inches on both sides, so 2.5 times 2 is 5. So the width of this apron right here is about 18 inches. Moving on to the second piece, now that we know the depth of this triangle and we know the height of the triangle, what is the length of the leg? This is where we'll use the Pythagorean theorem. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. Well, we know a squared and we know b squared, but we don't know c, the leg. So to break this down, we'll have to do the square root of those dimensions to get that distance. So we know 28 and we know 2.45 of the inset on each side. That, the square root of those is 28.11, which is roughly 28 inches and 1/8. So there you go. A little bit complex, but it's worth going through instead of just guessing.
Now it's time to cut our legs. And these are going to be 7/8 inch thick and then 1 1/2 inches wide. Now I haven't made too many desks, and my previous desk legs were thick, close to 1.5 inches thick and 2.5 inches wide. They did look a little beefy. Now I don't know if there is a quote right size or proportion, but if you feel like you have an opinion, please drop a comment below. I would love to see what other people size their legs to. Their table legs, that is. Now that we have our calculations done and our legs cut to near length, I want to transfer the angles using a protractor here so we can actually get the cut marked out at the top and the midsections for the stretcher and the apron. And I'm going to use a actual representative piece of material to get the widths. Now, here's an example of what this looks like in each of their respective angles. And to get this all cut in the exact same way that they're flush, you can flip them on their side in alternating patterns. And then you can take this over to the table saw and make one cut across the board. This makes it much more simple, and you ensure that you get the exact angles as their references to the top. Hopefully that makes sense.
All right, we have our legs now marked for the tapered half lap. Now there's a way that we can actually leverage a tapering jig here and your existing parts to have perfect half lap joints on an angle. So here are a few steps here. One, you'll take your piece that you are butting up to or doing the half lap. You'll want to set that to the inside of your tapering jig. Now this tapering jig goes straight up to my blade here. I ripped that. And then I'll move my fence in, make it snug to the tapering jig, lock that in. Now if I pull that out, and then I take my piece and set it to the flushed angle here, I will now have a perfect depth cut into this piece so that it will sit flush on the top. The second component of this to get a perfect half lap is that you want to use one of your offcuts on the exact same piece so you have the right amount of thickness. And then when you set this up here, what you'll want to do is, since you'll have it marked, you'll want to get as close as you can, but not to the line, and make passes on it, then flip over, and then make a pass. You want to get so close that the line actually disappears when you make that cut. That means you'll have the correct half width distance, and you'll make your passes perfectly for them to overlap. So let me show you and see how it goes. I want to talk about the tapering jig setup that I use. This is the micro jig F-style clamp with the dovetail slanted top. If you have a piece of scrap 3/4 inch plywood, you can make this in about 30 minutes. I went with this particularly because of the F-style clamp and the clamping pressure that you can do that, and then the number of setup options that you can do. Very simple. I'll put the links down in the description of the plans that they suggest, and then links to the specific clamps in the description so you can make it as well. Our blade is now at the perfect height for a half lap, and what I'm going to do now is move my tapering jig to match the, well, first off I'll make it match the exact distance I want for it to go in. Lock that in, pull that out. Then what I want to do is, this is one of my apron pieces. That's a 5-degree miter there. I want to slide that into the fence. So I now know this is exactly the distance of this width. And what I want to do is I will take a piece back here, and I want to make that as a point that I can register into. So I know I'll be doing that 5-degree cut every single pass. All right, there we go. Now our jig is perfectly set up for the angle, for the depth, the maximum depth that we go into the half lap, and then the maximum height that goes into our piece. So that way we do a perfect cut into this piece of material, and it should lay flat. Words. Okay, we have the legs cut. I have the apron cut. I do not have the stretcher cut. I actually want to keep this last. I want to glue the legs to the apron And then once that dries, I'm actually going to, I'll let this a little long. I want to drop that in so I can mark exactly where those cuts are, so I can get the correct distance here for the shoulder and half lap to rest in there. So let's do this.
Now, I didn't glue these last pieces up, or the stretchers for that matter, and I'm all about making joinery exact to your specific piece of material that you're cutting into. And here I'm taking a marking knife, just another means of getting exact kind of measurements, because this will put an indent into the piece. And I'm making marks so I can go back to the table saw to have that blade sit kind of right at that indent, so I know that I'm getting right up to the piece. So let's take a few passes and get that tightly fitted.
So our legs are glued up right now. Let's get back to the tabletop. Now, when we did the jointing and milling of these boards and glued them up, we had them at parallel sides and flat on top and bottom, so S4S. And one of the things I want to check before I finalize what this table looks like is I want to check for, is this side parallel to this? And a quick way of doing that is just taking a tape measure and measuring one end. So we got 25 1/8 and 25 1/8. So I know that I can make a 90-degree cut from over here and over here. And this table should be square, so I get the final width. Our tabletop is done, legs are done. Now it's time to actually install these together. There are numerous amount of methods to do it. I'm choosing to use threaded inserts with a bolt, but regardless, whatever method you choose, you need to consider the fact for seasonal wood movement. So I'm gonna get these installed, but I wanna show you how I'm gonna approach that with threaded inserts. All right. So yesterday I glued these on. I recessed the size of the bolt, which I don't have close by, and I created enough space in there for the bolt to laterally move depending on how much seasonal wood movement we get in this. And then I am going to attach these like this. Get them lined up so that way I can have knockdown furniture. Got one right here and one over here, so let's get those installed. Tabletop is connected to the legs now, and you can see it's on the top of the workbench, so I got a better angle here underneath. But if I move this side to side, you can see a lot of lateral movement, which is not great for the joints and just not very useful tabletop. So what we'll do here is, this is just a piece of scrap wood, but for demonstration purposes, if you push that into a corner here and create a triangle, just push this down into the leg. When you move this, it no longer has that lateral movement. And that triangle creates a rigid structure that makes this a very sturdy tabletop. We're going to use this leftover board here to create a very similar structure on the back side of this to prevent that racking. So let's go do that.
Now that we got that cut and we have our pilot holes for the legs drilled, I'm taking a brad point bit here and making a slight indentation on the stretcher so I can take it over to the drill press and make those exact measurements based off of where I drilled on the legs. I find it when you do it this way, you will have exact point to register versus using a tape measure and getting close to it.
Let's talk about sanding and the tools and equipment you need to get a stellar finish on your piece of furniture. I have a random orbital sander, 5-inch pads. Here are my sanding grits. I start with 80, move up to 120, 180, then 220. And I typically, in between each grit, I like to mark, just light marks across the piece of furniture. And as that mark goes away, then I know that I've had a pretty good finish with that particular grit. And I'll do that in between each stage of the pieces of sandpaper. And then lastly, you know, any nooks and crannies, you can use a sanding block or use any kind of piece of wood and just wrap these pieces of sandpaper around it. And then safety, so ensure you don't inhale any of the fine dust. I got mask here. So this is our tabletop. We're going to go through the progressions on the top, bottom and top, and I'll walk you through that. want to take a pause here. Two things I want to show you. You can see where the sanding has taken place and taken off where those pencil marks are and where you have not reached yet. So it's a good visual cue of where you are in your sanding progress. Two is when you go through the sanding progressions, when you run this, there's no need to press down hard on it. The grits will take care of itself. And if you did press down, you'll start to get a little swirl or kind of curly cue like pigtails on your piece of furniture, and it doesn't look good. So those two things as you go through the progressions of your sandpaper. Once I'm done sanding, I like to actually break down the edges either with a sanding block or give some type of feature with a routing bit. I'll use a roundover bit to give a little extra feature to the tabletop and also the base. It's all your personal preference, but it is good to at least break down the edges because these are very sharp, and you don't want to bump into it. It hurts. We are at the final stage. We are going to apply stain, and this is Danish oil. You don't have to use this. There are a plethora of different types of finishes out there in all different colors. This is just what I had on hand. As always, have protection, respirator. I got the windows and fan going, garage door open, so let that kind of flow out. But let's wrap this up. I have a random orderable, blah, blah, blah. We have all of our pieces cut. So here is a router, not a router, a jointer. What do you call this? Set of blades. Hands. Now we have the blade set to the perfect height for a half lap. Now let's put our, I like to use a kind of positive, making up words here.